Welcome everyone who is tuning in slowly but surely. We'll wait a few minutes to really get going, but just a couple of the random announcements that everyone likes to hear every time. Or if it's your first time, welcome to the P45, Parallel 45 Vines and Wines webinar series. We have Dr. Horst Kaspari here joining us today for a cover crop and vineyard floor management talk. So we have a couple of things to go over real quick. Annette has a couple things to say, and then we'll get on with further introductions and et cetera, et cetera. So go ahead, Annette, with the...
Sure. Thank you, Andy. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you again. Just a quick reminder that, I'm Annette, by the way, from MSU Extension. Sorry. Just a quick reminder for those that want to ask questions during the time. You can either click on the chat and type your question in the chat, or you can click on the question and answer box and type your question in there. If you have a question that requires speaking, whoops, let me go back. Down in the middle, if you hover your mouse over the middle, yours will actually say raise hand. If you click on raise hand, I can see that in the participant list, and then we can at a point unmute you if your question's a little more complex. We can unmute you, and then you can ask Dr. Kaspari your question. Back to you, Andy. Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Kaspari has a lot of slides to get through, which is great. We're going to get a lot of photos and stuff, I would assume. So if you're really not understanding something, feel free to ask a question then, but we'll certainly wait for any speaking opportunities until the end. So, and just kind of do a Q&A at the end for the most part. I do want to say one thing before we start, and I'm going to say it again after we start. Ishmael Nasrallah Hayazar is here again, and I just want to introduce him in case there's new folks that missed the last announcement. He is the MSU Extension Educator for the region, and I was meeting with him the other day at the research vineyard, and he is taken over the management of that, and he's looking for assistance out there. So stay tuned. I'm sure we're going to have an announcement via email from P45 about getting some volunteers out there to help with canopy management and some weed management issues. We have turned that vineyard into more of a research plot than what it was before. It was just a variety trial. So we want to keep it going. We have some young vines in there that need some tender care. And so I'm going to put out the bat signal for getting volunteers to help. You can contact Ishmael about that. Ishmael, do you want to say a few words about that and maybe share your email address?
Yes, sure. My name is Ismail Nasrullah Alzar. I'm viticulturist in Northwest Michigan. My office is in Winona County, and I'm responsible for managing vineyards in the research center. So I need help, as Andy said, and I will be more than happy to have you there. And even some people, they're volunteers, they need to learn, they need to be in touch with research center. I will be more than happy to have you there. Sorry if you don't hear me well. I have a problem with my laptop. So I'm going to share my screen. So my contact details, just a second. my contact details, I will be more than happy to have you here. So feel free to send me message or just email me or call me anytime. So thank you so much.
Okay, so there are the emails. We'll show those again at the end and talk about it again at the end for anyone who might have missed it. But without further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. Horst Kaspari to talk about vineyard floor management. And welcome.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, hello everyone. Let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm gonna share my screen because I have a few slides up here. Hang on a second. Go back. Okay, coming up, hopefully. And now it's not going into full mode. There we go. Okay, you should have a full screen now, do you? Yeah, my name is Horst Kaspari. I was born and raised in Germany. I'm just going to give you a very quick introduction. Maybe in these 30 seconds, you can get used to my accent. I studied agricultural science at the University of Bonn from 83 to 93. Along the way, I gained a master equivalent in 89 and the equivalent of a PhD in 93. I spent a year as a postdoc with hard research in Blenheim, New Zealand. So some of the things I'm going to talk to you today about will be about work I did back in New Zealand. Then was a scientist for the same organization down in Blenheim. And I've been with CSU 6 days short of 20 years now. So I came in 2000 and been the state viticulturist ever since. So what I want to talk to you today is two different types of cover crop studies that I've been doing. I've been doing cover crop studies for 27 years, so do have a little bit of history. One will be from Colorado, the other one will be from New Zealand. And really what I'd like you to focus more on than the individual results are the concepts. And the one take-home message that I'm going to give you right from the start is there's no one shoe fits all. Not even, I would argue, down a single aisle of a vineyard. Because I have not been to a vineyard that's 100% uniform from one end to the other. So maybe someone can put in the chat very quickly, you have 10 seconds to answer these questions. What is it that you see? 8, 6, 4, 3. Okay, so hopefully someone answered this. You're seeing tools. Okay, so
tools.
Good. Which one of the tools do you use? Well, I think that's a stupid question because you can't answer it unless you know what the task is. So hopefully, if you're going to go and plant a vineyard, you're not going to go to the top right corner here and take the yellow hammer. Okay, maybe you're going to do the bottom left and pick a shovel. And hopefully, if you're hanging a picture frame, you're not reaching for the shovel because that would be the wrong tool. So to me, cover crops are tools. So why do we use them? And this is just a partial list. And this partial list is pretty much what I'm focusing on right now here in Colorado. What I'm interested in is improvement in soil structure. All soils are not particularly good structurally. They're not particularly good in organic matter. They're not really good in biological activity. So I'm looking for those traits that cover crops can give me more of. I'm actually interested in getting more nitrogen into the vineyard, believe it or not. I know that cover crops can increase the water infiltration. They reduce soil compaction. Our soils are very heavy clay, so clay loams. So if we have even the smallest amount of rain, you cannot get into the vineyard with equipment. But I can when I have a cover crop, so it gives me faster access. I also know that with the use of cover crops, I can actually go and change vine growth. I can manipulate it more or less. And certainly, I'm interested in improving grape quality. And this last bullet point is specific to us. We have another site that's called Rogersmith. It's another research station. And we had a long-term trial there where we were comparing, I think we had like 18 varieties, and we grew them either with drip irrigation with a bare soil, or we grew them with micro sprinklers with a grass cover crop. And what we found over the years that bar one, we averaged about 2.3 times higher grape yields when we had micro sprinkler and a cover crop compared to drip. So that's of course, for that region, a very big increase because they were averaging about 1 ton an acre. And as you all know, you cannot make a living with 1 ton an acre crop. So even 2.3 is not where we want to be. Quick introduction to where we are. We are in Western Colorado, west of the Rockies. Our growing region is about 4,700, 4,800 feet in elevation. We are a semi-arid climate with about 8 inches of rainfall, precipitation. It is very evenly distributed a year. We have hot summers, cold winters. Average high in July is 93. So today we're forecasting like 86, 88. That's a cool day for us. Average low is in 18 in January. Of course, we all know that averages don't mean a whole lot. So record high is 107, record low is minus 21. And we are growing predominantly European grapes, Vitis vinifera. So let's get into the cover crop study that I want to talk about first. This is the study, again, following up from the earlier one, that we started in 2013. We have a Chardonnay vineyard here that was planted in 91, 92. So these vines were already 11, 12 years old. And our standard irrigation here in the valley has been basically 2 types. A lot of people still do furrow irrigation, believe it or not. But then we also have drip irrigation. And if you take back from the previous slide, we only have 8 inches of irrigation. So drip irrigation is obviously very water efficient, good thing for us to use. But with that little rainfall, your aisle, your drive middle really has a hard time growing anything. So our standard was crested wheatgrass. Crested wheatgrass is a very drought tolerant grass. It will actually start greening up in spring early. By this time of year, it looks like a wheat field that just got harvested. There's nothing but brown. And then it might regreen again in fall if we have some rainfall. Although it's drought tolerant, over the years, it actually ends up pretty much disappearing. And you end up with kosher and bindweed, which, 2 of my favorite, weeds, basically. So we wanted to look at something else. And for the reason that I mentioned earlier, soil fertility, organic matter, access to the vineyard, etc. And so we introduced 3 different cover crop or cover crop mixes. We put in a hard fescue, the same we had used at the previous study. We put in a legume mix, and we put a grass legume mix in. And everything was replicated 4 times. And those 3 cover crops were actually micro sprinkler irrigated. So we used High Crest for the crested wheatgrass, Aurora Gold for the hard fescue. It's a very low-growing, creeping, sod-forming grass that actually happens to be Roundup tolerant, or glyphosate tolerant, and it's not a GMO, it's actually naturally selected. For the legume mix, we use alfalfa and birds for trefoil. Birds for trefoil never established, so we're talking about pretty much a pure stand of alfalfa. And then the orchard mix had 3 grasses and 2 clovers. This is what this looked like. So this was put in September, just after Chardonnay harvest. We did use micro sprinkler on the crested wheatgrass to just get it established. And then we switched back to drip. So this is in March 2014. You can still see the single rows where grass was drilled in, and you see obviously quite a bit of other things growing there as well. You can actually see this trial from the sky. That's what I wanted to report. This is a Google Earth image from 2005. And I'm not sure you can see my cursor. Hopefully you can see it. You can see these 2 dark areas here. This actually happens to be an alpha plot. You can see another one over here. And so what's important to understand is that this in the center here is the row of vines. So there's like 6 rows here. And so what we have a guard row, and then in the second row, you have the cover crop on either side, because really that's what we want to look at, the same regime on both sides. The next row over that acts as a guard row again. Just lost my cursor here. There you go. So the next row is again a guard row. So then the number 4 row here is again where we have these different treatments. And the lighter colored ones are different types of cover crops. So the alfalfa just happens to really stand out here, and you can see this obviously from a very far distance away. So what we were interested in predominantly is what effect the cover crop would have on vine nutrition, yield, and fruit quality. And we also were very interested on the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of what the cover crop might do. Keep in mind, we're coming from a drip irrigation, crested wheatgrass, sort of turning to bare soil, turning to weedy type of interrow to start with. So one of the questions we wanted to answer is, what do those cover crops provide? And what I mean with that is, how much biomass do those different types of cover crops produce? And actually, what is in that biomass? So to do that, we actually, this is our ride-on lawnmower, and here's a really good illustration of what crested wheatgrass does look like in the middle of summer. This is only the 4th year after it was established, and you can already see large patches of bare soil, and you also can see that there's nothing growing. This is a totally dry interrow area here because the vines are irrigated by drip. So we use this mower to collect the pruning weights, from the biomass. Here you can see a photo from, this is in November, the final cutting of alfalfa, and the mower in the foreground, we have our raw gold. We take this biomass, we harvest it basically, we take it over to the scale, and we actually determine how much fresh matter did we actually harvest. We take a sample out. With that sample, we determine the dry matter of the biomass. We also take more samples out and send them to the lab. Everything else that we're not using for sampling to either determine the dry matter or the nutrient concentration, we put back in exactly the same plot where we harvested it from. So there's 4 treatments, 4 reps, 2 sites. So we have like 32 different plots where we have to bring back the biomass that we just took out, and then spread it out again as if it was mowed in situ, basically. So here's a look at what biomass was produced under our conditions. And again, this is, remember, the crested wheatgrass, the small graph on the left, will be abbreviated with the CW. The Aurora Gold, which is our pure grass, hard fescue, very short growing, barely gets more than 4 or 5 inches tall. Then the legume is basically alfalfa, and then the orchard mix, the bar on the right, is actually the 3 grasses, 2 clover mix. Each color here represents the biomass produced in the cutting, and this is the 3rd season that we, after the cover crop were established. And what you can see is that the smallest biomass was produced by the crested wheatgrass. Not surprising, vines are drip irrigated. There's no water getting into the interrow area. Just under 200 grams fresh weight, whereas the alfalfa had almost 4 times that, sorry. And the next graphs basically show pretty much the same thing going through the season from 15 all the way to 18. And each time it's the same picture. So this is cumulative now over a 4-year period. We didn't do 19. We are starting to get more data from 20. And again, it pretty much holds. We're having more than 4 times the biomass production of the leguminous cover crop compared to a crested wheatgrass that's getting less and less grass and more weedy or dry soil. So that was the answer on the biomass. So why would you care? We are interested in the soil health aspects as well. So from a fresh weight matter, 9.1 tons for the legume, 2.8 tons of dry weight, 4.3 tons of biomass. But what exactly is in that biomass, and what actually does it do for the vines? So this is a totally revolutionary outcome, and I'm kidding here. Legumes actually have high nitrogen content in their biomass. And sure enough, that graph does show that yes, legumes have high nitrogen, about 1% more nitrogen in the biomass in the legume cover crop, the green triangles at the top, compared to the grasses or grass-clover mixes. So a lot of nitrogen in that biomass. And because we don't have that much time, and I want to focus on some of the big pictures. So this is a table that shows the main effects on what nutrients were high or low in the cover crops over a 4-year period. So not surprising, we found the highest concentration of nitrogen in the biomass in the alfalfa. That's a given, right? But we also found that the legume cover crop, the alfalfa, was really high in potassium. Of all the cover crops, it always had the highest concentration of sulfur. It always was high in boron, and sulfur and boron are very important for legumes, so that's good to see that they actually have high levels. On the other hand, it was very low in zinc and very low in manganese. Zinc, manganese, iron, boron are very important nutrients for us. We have our vineyards, orchards are all on very high alkaline soils. And when you have high pH, those nutrients start to get locked up in the soil, and our plants have a problem taking them up. So zinc, manganese, iron deficiencies are very common for us to observe. So having a cover crop with low levels is not ideal. If you look at the other extreme, and the crested wheatgrass, it always had, the lowest level of nitrogen, lowest amount of phosphorus, lowest concentration of sulfur, but it was high in manganese and it was high in calcium. So that's the concentration within the biomass. But we're going to take it a step further. Remember that the legumes had 4.3 times the biomass than crested wheatgrass. So what we do next, and here's a graph again illustrating this. What we do next then is say, okay, we'll have to consider not just the biomass concentration, the concentration, but also the biomass production. And so we multiply those two things out, and then to actually look at what nutrients are these cover crops potentially providing in the system. And this is one of the big answers here. When we look at the cover crop on an annual basis, we have the equivalent of 147 pounds per acre of nitrogen that is in that legume biomass. And I don't know about you guys, but I certainly do not recommend applying 140 pounds of nitrogen to a vineyard on an annual basis. So that's a lot of nitrogen. Next is orchard mix with about a little bit over 50 pounds. That's still a pretty high number, but it's in the biomass, right? And the crested wheatgrass was less than 20 pounds of N in that biomass. So if we mow this alfalfa in place, and this is an N that's basically being recycled maybe, what happens to that 147 pounds? What's it going to do to the grapevine? So manganese, and I don't remember the slide a few slides up, that was one where the legume was really low. It always had the lowest concentration. But by the virtue of the really high biomass, the total amount of manganese that's actually recycled in the system is actually higher than anything else. Although the legumes has the lowest concentration, by virtue of the high biomass production, there is still more manganese in that biomass than any other cover crop treatment. So what we found, no matter what nutrient we looked at, the legume always had the highest content in the biomass. So what are all these nutrients doing to the grape? How is it affecting the vine nutritional status? So to determine that, we do what pretty much everyone does. You either take petiole sample at bloom, or we tend to take leaf blades at veraison. We get them analyzed. We also have an enophos analyzer that actually tells us what the amino acids and the ammonia is, so we can determine what the yen level in the must is. And so we are looking for those two data points. And so this graph here shows what the leaf nitrogen was at veraison. And so 13 over to the very left, that's our starting point. That's when the cover crop was actually first planted. So that's sort of the baseline. And what we're seeing 2 years later, already a significantly higher amount of nitrogen in the leaf blades at veraison, where we have a cover crop that's made out of alfalfa. And if you look at it, it's always higher, and it, you know, it actually, surprisingly to me, if you look at the 5-year trend, that trend is down for every single treatment. Now remember, there's 147 pounds of nitrogen in that biomass. And yet we are seeing a declining nitrogen in the leaf blade. So that's an interesting question, what's happening there, right? And I would argue that the gap between the legume and the grasses or grass mixes are actually increasing. But it's interesting that we're seeing a declining level of nitrogen in the leaf blade. The differences in the leaves weren't actually that big. I mean, you're talking 0.2, 0.3, it's not that high. But what really stood out is the yen levels. So what we're seeing here, this is our 5 years of yen data from our Chardonnay grapes. The black bar is the crested wheatgrass again, red, the Aurora Gold, the legume in green, and the orchard mix in the Bordeaux color. And again, you can very clearly see that the legumes are much, much higher yen. And after 2017, I was going like, well, 450 yen, this is getting out of control. This is really excessive. Then 2018 came along. 2018, we produced the biggest crop of Chardonnay in the last 25 years, well, since the vineyard existed, basically. It's not quite 25. But, you know, we had the biggest crop ever, and the yen level just went totally down. And if you look at the other 3 treatments in both 18 and 19, and, you know, we can have a little discussion on this if you want later on, but I would argue that these musts are anemic. They definitely don't meet the minimum yen requirements for healthy fermentation. And you might have a different viewpoint on this, but a lot of our industry doesn't harvest at 20, 21, 22 bricks. We are very common to harvesting 24, 25, 26. And so a must that has less than 150 parts per million yen is already considered insufficient in nitrogen for healthy fermentation, even if you're at the low bricks level. And, you know, by the time you get to 24, 25 bricks, the recommendation is you want to be at least 250. So these other three treatments in 18 and 19 did not meet that. So they would have been to be augmented in the winery. And that was actually one of the drivers for looking at legumes in the vineyard, because we're getting feedback from our industry that the majority of Colorado musts are low in nitrogen status. And we can actually confirm that because we have now run thousands and thousands of samples for the industry, looking at the chemistry, and we know what the yen for many varieties is actually often well below 150, sometimes below 100. So that's actually is a fact. So the nutrient concentration in the legume really has been consistently effective for the following nutrients in terms of being higher or lower. So we always find the highest nitrogen, highest potassium, highest sulfur, and highest boron, but the lowest zinc and manganese. However, the only consistent effect we can see on the grapevine by way of leaf analysis or by looking at the must is for nitrogen. None of the others, the higher level potassium, sulfur, boron, we do not see that represented in the grape leaves themselves. So the higher legume mix, in this case for us, did have the highest biomass. The high concentration of N in that biomass led to higher concentration in the grape crop itself, in the fruit, and also the grape leaves. And the higher must yen with the legume cover crop. And as I said earlier, in 2017, I was asking, is this yen getting excessive? And by the time we hit like a 5 or 6 ton crop an acre, that yen went to 200. So definitely wasn't the case. However, as I already said, high cover crop nutrient concentration of certain nutrients do not result in higher grape leaf concentration. So a lot of the things take time when you look at cover crop studies from my past experience. And I want to go to a past experience at this point in time, but I want to open up for questions for a moment, if the time allows, to just talk about that first part, the Colorado part. If anyone has any questions, and that maybe you can monitor the chat box and read out if there are questions before I move on to the next part.
There aren't any yet.
Okay, good.
Does anyone have a question? Or you can click raise your hand.
I have a quick question. And Dr. Kaspari, can you talk a little bit about the differences, if any, of getting that nitrogen into the vine when you incorporate it into the soil versus leaving it on the surface?
When what we do, we mow it and actually we take it out or we bring it back. So we actually would do like what you would do when you just mow your vineyard. The question that it's a really good question, Andy, and it's one that I'm sort of struggling with a little bit, because 147 tons of nitrogen with a legume, and we're just seeing these small increases. So the question is, what is happening there? Are we measuring the same nitrogen over and over? So like we do the first cut, we have all that biomass high in nitrogen, it deteriorates, it gets broken down, and the alfalfa just picks it up again, and then we measure it again in the second cut, in the third, in the fourth? Or is this truly new nitrogen? Every time we mow, there's like that legume produces more, and we're finding more of it. And this is a question we're trying to address this year. So ask me in a year's time, I have an answer for that one. As far as incorporating and cultivating, that should give you more of a spike, because with cover crops, with mulches, with compost, we assume that about 50% of the nitrogen or many other nutrients that are in that cover crop or in that mulch gets released in the first year. And then others, some other stuff breaks down over the next 2 or 3 years. But if you do a cultivation, you actually, and bring in organic matter into the soil, you actually stimulate the biological activity. And these microbes and fungi and bacteria start, basically working away. And that would leave more of a spike in nitrogen than not incorporating it and just leaving it at the surface for it to go down slowly. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
We don't
I
have
think
any
when you
Oh, sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to mention we don't have any open questions in the question and answer right now.
Okay, good. So let me take you to a very different place. We're changing hemisphere, we go into the south. We're changing variety, we go into Sauvignon Blanc. We're going from a semi-arid to a temperate oceanic climate. I mentioned 8 inches of rainfall in our area here in Colorado. In Blenheim, down where we're going next, we're talking about 24, 26, 28, 30-inch rainfall. But relatively evenly distributed throughout the year as well. And the task is a little different. What I really want to do with this study is actually reducing vine vigor. And the background to this is that many of the grapevines that we were growing in New Zealand are really excessively vigorous. I mean, you have in the Marlborough region where Sauvignon Blanc rules, you have a lot of good, fertile, sandy loam, loamy clay soil, deep profiles, pretty much 2 inches, or a little bit more every month. So things grow, and Sauvignon Blanc is actually quite vigorous. The downside to this high vigor is that it affects both yield and fruit quality. Yield in the shape of different things, encourages diseases, so botrytis is one thing to worry about, but also shaded canopies lead to lower fruitfulness when you start shading the canes, because it actually reduces the fruitfulness of the buds. And so what we were looking for were techniques, other than having a guy on a tractor spending all summer trimming down and hedging the canopy, that would actually control vigor. And when I mentioned this guy driving a tractor, that's not a joke. We worked on a very large property where one person spent all season trimming, all summer long, nothing else, trimming. I mean, the vineyard was also 700-800 acres big, but still, that's sort of a bit of a waste of time, in my opinion. So the idea of the cover crop here was that we might choose cover crops that would start growing, and by virtue of growing and transpiring, removing water from the soil several weeks before bud burst of the grapevines. And so what these cover crops would do, they would actually start putting a soil water deficit in the system, first establish it and then maintain it. And if we were ever getting too dry, most vineyards were set up with drip irrigation. We could use supplemental irrigation to counteract the excessive dryness. In the 5 years that I'm going to talk about here, once did we turn on the irrigation system. One single time. So no, it wasn't needed. It's there, but it's actually probably not needed. So the first trial we established was back in '91. The vines were 10 years old, Sauvignon Blanc and SO4 rootstock, basically 6 by 9 feet spacing. In New Zealand, Marlborough, we pruned grapes by quadrilateral canes, so 4 canes, 15 buds each for a total of 60. And we were using vertical shoot positioning VSP systems. The inter-row treatments that we applied was bare soil. And at the time when this study was started, you could not find a vineyard with a cover crop. Everything was bare soil aisles, either by glyphosate application or by cultivation. Virtually no one had a cover crop, permanent cover crop in the interrow. They might have something growing over the winter months. Keep in mind, New Zealand winter is very mild. I used to mow my lawn much more in winter than in summer. You get rainfall, so things get green in the aisle, but then there's cultivated or sprayed out. So that was the standard, bare soil. So we put in ryegrass, the idea here being it is a shallow, dense root system. And we put in chicory, which has a very deep taproot system. And our purpose with this trial was to control excessive vine vigor, not reduce yield if we can, and at least maintain fruit quality. So this first slide, and I'm going to use the same colors pretty much throughout the talk here. If you see a black triangle or black symbol, that's the bare soil. If you see green, that stands for ryegrass, and if you see blue, it stands for chicory. Hopefully you guys know what chicory looks like. It has a nice little blue flower, so that's blue. The first slide basically shows, this is 95, 96 season. So in the Southern Hemisphere, we start growing in October, we harvest in April. It shows the soil moisture. And what it does show, this is measured right at the base of the vine. A small separation between bare soil and where we have a cover crop in the aisle. So there's a little bit more drying going on. It's not big, but it's certainly noticeable. If you take the same year and actually look at what's happening in the interrow area, so this is soil moisture measured right in the center of the dry vial. And what you're seeing, there's quite a large difference. They all start out very similar, but then they end up drying down more dramatically when you have a cover crop in the middle. Okay, and so we're creating 6, 7, 8% soil moisture difference. And that's starting to get quite dry. When you're down to 15%, field capacity is over 30. You're less than half field capacity at this point in time. So small differences at the vine, but big differences in the interrow. And I think we probably all agree that grapevines don't strictly have their root system going up and down the row, that they spread out, that they go into the drive middle, that they go deep. So we're drying out a significant part of the soil growth of the root zone system of the grapevine. This is what we were after. This shows shoot length. It's in meter, 1.8 is about, 6 feet. So you get an idea of the shoot growth. So these shoots were measured all season long. We didn't trim those. These were actually protected from trimming. And we just kept measuring them. And what you can see that even where we have a cover crop, they still haven't shut down. So 140, 150 days. This is in April. This is shortly before harvest. So grapes grow a long season. But you can see a very, very big difference where we have a bare soil middle versus a cover crop. With the chicory, probably a little bit less than the ryegrass. This is another year. It shows, or actually, I think it's the same year. It shows how much we actually trimmed off. So this is the summer pruning weight per vine. So we're trimming off somewhere around 4 pounds of shoots, tips, in the first cutting in early January. And then 6 weeks later, we come back, 7 weeks later, we have another, in the bare soil that is, we have another at least 3 pounds that are being trimmed off. So clearly an indication there's a lot of growth happening in that bare soil. From a practical perspective, I'm not sure I would have even trimmed the chicory in January. I most certainly would have not needed to trim it in February, but for the research purpose, that's what we do, right? So these shoots never really got much beyond the top wire. So they would have been perfectly fine to just leave alone. And you can see the regrowth between January and February is very, very minimal. So clearly an indication that we were able to stop the canopy growing in early summer. And then not surprisingly, what we're seeing when we look at the winter pruning weights, we actually been able to reduce the winter pruning weight in the order of 50 to 60%, depending if it's a ryegrass or a chicory that we were using. And before you get too excited about this, I always call chicory the nuclear option for vigor control. If you have a small vigor problem, do not use chicory. Some of our New Zealand growers did that. 3 years later, they were cultivating out and spraying out the chicory because they totally ran the vigor of the vineyard in the ground. They had no vigor left. Okay, so this is really something that you apply in a very high vigor situation and not when you got a small problem. So what did it do to the fruit? So this is monitoring fruit size, basically. And one thing that we found very consistently, this is a 5-year study, that we saw an earlier beginning of the raisin. The onset of the raisin was about a week advanced where we had a cover crop. It is very consistent with, when you're starting to see water stress, you tend to get into earlier raisin. And so we saw this beginning of ripening happening about a week before the bare soil. They all ended up pretty much the same berry size. We never had any problem with fruit set. The water stress develops later than that when we have fruit set going on. So we always ended up pretty much the same berry size. Soluble solids were up and down. One year was one on more, one on the other. Oh, excuse me here, I've got someone calling me. Oh, we ignore it. So the main effect that we saw, and we saw that in this study and many others, the biggest effect was on the titration acidity. And you're growing in a cool climate, so you appreciate when you have 10 grams acid in a Sauvignon Blanc, that might not be your ideal profile. So we were able on average to get the acidity down by 1.5, sometimes 2 grams. And that's a really, really big difference for a cool climate where in New Zealand we were striving to get acidity down because it's always too high. Here's 5 years of data on the yield. We basically see no difference or very, very minor difference in yield. Again, years go up and down. This is, pretty much no effect on yield. And now I'm going to switch once again. Same type of study, but we're going to a different area of New Zealand. We're going to Gisborne. It's on the North Island on the east side. It's a very high rainfall, very warm climate. You're talking about 40-inch plus of rainfall. And in this case, we worked with a large company and we were looking at pretty much the same cover crop systems. But here we have some really nice data on what it does to disease. So the solid gray on the right, the tall bar, that's actually the bare soil. And on the very left, we have the chicory. And on the first graph, we're looking here at botrytis incidence on the left and the botrytis severity. So incidence means, can you find it, can you not find it? So if you had 100 bunches, in 57 of them, we would find botrytis if it was grown in a bare soil environment, but only 26 of them if it was actually in a cover crop. And then if we look closer at the infected bunches, we see that the severity is higher. There's more berries infected in the bare soil or control treatment at 11% versus only 5.7% being affected in the chicory. So if you multiply that out, you actually find that almost 6.4% of the cover crop of the bare soil fruit is infected by botrytis versus 1.5% on the chicory treatment, the most extreme treatments here. And we also saw a very nice effect on the incidence and severity of downy mildew. So Gisborne is a downy climate. They hardly ever get powdery mildew. They always fight downy mildew. Marlborough almost never gets downy. Powdery mildew is the main disease down there. So we saw a very nice difference here with the cover crop, the chicory, reducing the incidence severity of downy mildew on the leaves. This is with Chardonnay. So again, and keeping in mind the time here, our purpose with the New Zealand studies was to control vigor, and that was really achieved by these cover crops. We looked at many others, many different grasses. Again, the nuclear option is chicory. I have never worked with anything that's so devigorating. Ryegrass is pretty good. Roam grass for us in New Zealand did absolutely nothing. There were a few other grasses that really no effect. They looked pretty, they gave you a greener aisle, but they had no effect on the grapes. So in the New Zealand condition, we can use those cover crops to actually dry out the soil profile and then maintain it drier, thereby giving us an effect on the vegetative growth. If, and I said that earlier, if there was a concern about too much stress, we did have the option of irrigating because people did have irrigation systems in place, which in the 5 years in the Sauvignon Blanc, we did one irrigation. We were able to manipulate or alter the fruit quality. We later on did a very, very large study. I mean, our study site was about 20 acres. So these were, machine harvested. We had, rows that were 1,200 feet long, and 3 of them was one treatment. So this was big, and the winery did make wine from those trials separately. And, when the winemakers evaluated the different cover crops versus the bare soil, it was a 4-3 split. 4 like one, 3 the other, etc. So, but they all ended up using it because they can see how they can blend it, even if some didn't like it. So even the wine quality was, altered. Some liked it, some didn't, but they actually eventually did use those cover crops. The reduction in vigor can also help you with disease problems. And that's, again, if you're growing Chardonnay up in the Gisborne area, that is very important. So here's a summary slide of many different trials that I've done in Colorado and New Zealand. And so in Colorado, we so far, even with our legume cover crop in there, we have not seen an effect on vine vigor or yield. In New Zealand, yield wasn't affected, but vine vigor was our target, so we reduced it. Quality, I think, has been improved, certainly from a disease perspective in Gisborne, reducing acidity in the Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough. And if you consider higher yen, a quality characteristic in Mustang, I guess, in Colorado, we improved the quality. We've never seen anything in Colorado regarding pH, TA, Brix, or any of those numbers. But we have higher nitrogen. Vine nutrition was affected positively by the legume in terms of nitrogen, but the chicory actually really starved the grapes from nitrogen. So some of the effect on lower vigor isn't just from water in this study, but was also from nitrogen. These Sauvignon Blanc canopies looked sort of pale green compared to the bare soil. And we were actually just dropping below the recommended range, but we never saw an effect on fruit set. So we just said, okay, or fruit quality or anything. So we just said, just let it go, it's okay. Disease, I mentioned to Andy earlier, what disease in Colorado? We don't have disease. So there has been no effect. If you have nothing, whatever you do doesn't change it. So that's no effect there. In New Zealand, yes, we reduce botrytis, reduce downy mildew. Soil organic matter has been increasing in our Colorado study. Soil organic matter doesn't change quickly. This is now 7 years since we put the cover crop in, so that's a very slow process. We have seen more biological activity with a cover crop compared to a bare soil. Again, that's not surprising. The bare soil is very dry, there's nothing growing there. And this is a question that probably you guys would ask. What does all that nitrogen do to cold hardiness? So far, nothing. We have never seen any effect on any of the cover crops on cold hardiness. I want to leave you with a few thoughts here. We like to do things black and white, but the world isn't. My vineyard isn't. There's no rule that you can just do one thing, in the vineyard, and I would even argue down a single aisle. So remember the setup of our study where we have these 2 cover crops on both sides of a vine, and then we have a guard row. So those guard rows actually have panels where you have one cover crop on one side, but another on the other. So we just had a quick look last year. This is the first data we have. What actually happens when you have, the grass on one side, but there's a legume on the other side. So on the left, this left column here shows when you have the same cover crop on both sides of the aisle. Both aisles are the same cover crop. On the right side, right column, it shows you what happens when you have top line here, aurora gold on one side, but the legume on the other. And in each of those cases, what you see, that the nitrogen is somewhat higher when you have a legume on one side and a grass on the other, or the orchard mix on the other. So again, if I'm worried about excessive nitrogen from a pure legume cover crop, I don't have to do pure legume. I can alternate. I can do one in the other, and a different one in the other row. It's pretty simple. There's also no reason or no rule that says you have to mow the cover crop, each row at the same time. In fact, some of the organic growers we worked with purposefully didn't do that because they would remove all the flowering plants they had as a cover crop all at once. And what would the beneficial insects do? So you mow one aisle, you leave the other row alone. And then later on you change. So that, getting back to Andy's point, will change the release of nitrogen and other nutrients that is coming from the decaying biomass. You don't do it all at once. It's only part of it. And then, as I said, there's no rule that you can just use one cover crop for a vineyard. In our New Zealand study, we had in some of the sites, we had really shallow topsoil overlaying pure gravel on one end. And then we had 6-7 feet of topsoil, really nice clay loam, sandy clay loam all the way down. And those plants didn't grow the same, obviously. Why would you put the same cover crop in it? Why would you put chicory all throughout? You might want chicory in that deep soil, but you certainly should not be using it at the shallow end. And actually growers have been doing that down in Marlborough, where they actually been looking at what is their soil profile, what is the problem, and then adjust the cover crop actually virtually down the aisle, changing it from one to the other. Coming back to an earlier point I made, we left the cover crop in the interrow, and that 147 pounds of nitrogen, am I counting the same thing over and over, or is it real? Is it really new nitrogen being produced? So that's something that we want to look into. What would happen if you did a mow and throw system? What if you transferred that biomass and put it right under the vine row? Would you increase the nitrogen even more, or other nutrients for that matter? And finally, that's something that I've been thinking of, because legumes are not very traffic tolerant. And so when we put in orchard mixes, we drive the tractor up and down the aisle a lot, we see those legumes disappear. But we can go in and actually go and for example, take the drill down the middle, have a certain number of slots open, and just put down the grass, and then take the same row later on again and actually have a legume mix in, shutting down where we put the grass and put the legumes right between or to the edge. That's something maybe less important to vineyards, but it's certainly an important part for peaches, for example. Peach roots really do not like to want to grow into the interrow if you have grass, but they very happily go in if there's legumes. So that's something that I've been thinking about. We don't have to do this always the same thing. Let's think outside the box and address the problem at hand. I'd like to acknowledge the folks who've been working on this. I'll leave this slide up here and open it up for questions.
We do have a question from a participant. Do you measure the nitrogen in the soil from the legumes through the roots?
We actually have taken soil samples. Again, this was something that we did before we started, because we were interested how the cover crops would change it. And then we did it again after 5 years. So that's plenty of time to actually find something. And we found surprisingly little nitrogen in the soil samples. It was, you're talking quite small amounts that are in the soil. So I think most of that nitrogen in the legume is still in the tuberous root, basically. I was surprised how little nitrogen we found. There's almost no difference between legume, grass, or bare soil.
Okay, thank you. Reminder to anyone, if you have a question, you can click on the Q&A box at the bottom. If you have a question for Dr. Kaspari, you can just wait just a few minutes.
Thank you.
I have a question, Dr. Kaspari. do you have any information on whether a full stand of grass, maybe even a mixture of grass and legumes and some flowering plants at full canopy height would transpire and pull more water out of the soil profile versus a shorter, maybe 4-inch mode of the same mix?
Yes, it would, because you have a much larger transpiring surface area. So when you actually look at modeling this, so when you look at, for example, alfalfa, every time you do a cut, the parameter we call a crop coefficient drastically declines. So at a full stand, an alfalfa has a crop coefficient of 1.15, 1.2, something like that. So it uses significantly more water than a turf. The moment you cut it, it goes well below the turf. That's the effect of the leaf area, transpiring surface area. Yes, a high stand would use a lot more water than a small stand.
We do have a question from Brian. What kind of soil biological changes were you seeing?
So biological changes, so that it's the community that's there. So two things happened in the bare soil in Colorado here. That's basically dry. You end up with overall a lower number of bacteria, fungi, lots of different things that we looked at first. And secondly, the activity is much reduced. So, and third, what we're seeing is a shift. So you're seeing a shift. This is the colleagues of mine who do this work, so I'm probably going to blunder here a little bit. But we're seeing a shift towards more fungi compared to bacteria and more turnover of organic matter. So species that are more into decomposition of organic material have actually increased. So you got basically two things. You got three things: lower number of bacteria, fungi, other things, higher activity of whatever is there, but also a shift more towards the fungal composition versus bacterial composition, where we had the cover crop. And then each cover crop is a little bit different. But that's sort of like looking at the two extremes.
Sorry, I have a question. Probably slightly off topic. Is those cover crop or weeds have allopathic effect on, grapevine, and that we can detect in our wine or not?
So there is some data that suggests that there's an allelopathic response of grapes, or interaction between that and grasses. So I've heard that if you put a stick into a grass zone, it will actually not root. I'm not sure that it's true, but if you look at the effect, for example, if you have a grass cover crop or grasses growing near young planted vines, they really don't want to grow. Grass is probably the worst thing you can have next to a grapevine. And that has to do with the root exudates of the grass basically stopping and slowing down the development of the root development of the grapes. I mentioned kochia. I don't know if you know what kochia is, but grows up pretty tall. If you don't control it, might be the size of a Christmas tree. Pretty obnoxious weed. You can have that growing next to a grapevine where you think like, man, this weed, look at this. It's 3 times the size of the grapevine. Grapevine is growing quite happily. You take a tiny growing grass and your grapevine doesn't grow. So that's where the interaction comes from the cover crop. So some weeds that look like they're really gonna suppress our grapevine growth do nothing. And then this tiny grass actually totally stunts the grapevine. And that's where the exudate from the grass roots is important. So I mentioned earlier to Andy, we do control, cover crops, weeds, whatever, on young vines. But, our Chardonnay is coming up to 30 years of age. It's not like I have to worry what happens in the first 6 inches of the profile. So I purposefully did not show you a picture of what the vineyard looks like because we don't use herbicides. I mean, call them weeds, call them companion plants, whatever you want to call them. I don't worry about them. So we don't, in the worst case, we go in and actually hand mow it with a line trimmer, and that's about it. if they start blocking the sprinklers. But those, if I mentioned earlier, I look at a vineyard and look at the problem. So if my problem is high vigor, why would I remove anything that's competitive with the grapevine? What benefit do I have from removing competition if I fight high vigor? No, I'm diverged, sorry.
Well, I don't see any other questions incoming. So I will say thank you very much, Dr. Kaspari, for joining us and sharing all of your research. And I just want to say again that we're looking for volunteers at the let me start my video for the helping out at the research station. So Ishmael, if you could share your slide again, we can get your email up there and people can contact you. It's a great thing to do on the weekend or next week. I was out there and we need to drop fruit. We need to, on young vines, we need to drop fruit. They need some leaf removal and some tucking, and it's only like an acre. So if we can all lend a hand, I'm sure Ishmael would appreciate it, and all future research projects that benefit all of us, our wineries, our vineyards, would also appreciate it. So that's my plug for the research vineyard. Thanks everyone. Annette, do you have anything to say about the spray credits?
Yes, I do. First, I want to thank Dr. Kaspari for doing this talk today, and especially last minute. Just some housekeeping items. Just a reminder that we have another webinar in 2 weeks on August the 7th. I think Esmail and Andy know the subject matter. I'm sorry, I didn't. But tune in again in 2 weeks from 12 to 1.
Yeah, that's actually going to be, thank you, I forgot to plug that. That's actually going to be a speaker, a technical speaker from Enardis is going to discuss different tools in the winery that can assist with any compromised fruit that's coming in. So stay tuned for that. He's got a couple different tools he wants to discuss for compromised fruit in the winery.
Okay, good. And for those of you that were, you don't need to do a bubble sheet. When you registered, you get 1 credit for attending today's live session. You might want to write down this code just in case to prove that you attended if there's ever a question. And for those that are seeking certified crop advisor, you can, I'm going to leave this up for a minute. You can scan that on your smartphone and it'll take you right to the website to get those credits. Thank you. That's all
Anything
I have.
else? Any other questions, last minute questions coming in? Okay, well, thanks everyone. Have a good weekend and a good Friday. And thank you again, Dr. Kaspari.
My pleasure. Take care, you guys. Stay healthy.
Bye.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.